I had an undergraduate degree in physics from India. Then I went to Ohio University, which is a decent university, but it's not like a top rank university, and did theoretical physics. Then I switched to biology at University of California, San Diego, but I didn't go on to get a second degree. Then I used a weird technique, neutron scattering, to look at a biological problem. And then I'm applying to biology and biochemistry departments. These people look at so there are two kinds of places. One are like research universities, and they look at neutron scattering, and they think, does this guy want a nuclear reactor? We don't have one on campus. And anyway, what's this neutron scattering going to do for biology? And he's been to all these sort of, we don't even know what to make of his CV, and he doesn't have any papers in top, fancy journals and so on. And so they just put my application into pile B, and I probably have done the same thing. And then I also applied to four-year colleges. America has lots and lots of excellent four-year colleges, and some not so excellent ones too. They probably saw, hey, wait a minute, look at this guy's long name, he's from India. We don't even know if he speaks English, How do we know he's even going to be able to teach? And he has this slightly weird background. And so I went into pile B for them too. And so I was actually lucky in the end to get a job at a national lab. But the thing was, I didn't drop out of science. And so the point I want to make is, despite all this, I tried to keep my options open. So I went to Oak Ridge National Lab, and that didn't last very long because I went there under a misunderstanding. And it turned out I couldn't do my own research. And then I got bailed out a second time when I went to Brookhaven National Lab. And the point is, at each point, I was trying to keep my options open to be able to continue to do science rather than dropping out. But I did have a plan B or C. I could have become a computer programmer because this was still in the early 80s. And, Silicon Valley had not taken off yet. It was just about to take off. Or I could have become a high school science or math teacher. Those were my two options. And I think I would have been okay. Certainly I would have been happy as a high school science and math teacher. I think that's a very worthy profession. I think I got into ribosomes somewhat by accident, as is often the case in science. I was a graduate student at UC San Diego. I'd switched from physics to biology, and I came across an interesting article by two people at Yale, and I ended up writing to them, and they offered me a fellowship. That's how I got into it, but the reason I was interested in it was because it lies right at the crossroads of biology. So if you think of biology, biology is essentially a sort of self-perpetuating system that carries information. You have cell, but the cell has information not only to make it work, but to produce more cells. And that information resides in our genes. But most of the molecules that carry out many of the functions of the cell, how it moves or how it, or even how it divides, are carried out by proteins, the thousands of proteins. Each protein is made by information in a gene, and a gene is a stretch of information along DNA. And the molecule that takes that genetic information and converts it to a protein is this enormous molecule called the ribosome. And I had a physics training. I was doing biology, and this seemed like a great problem to tackle because it was fundamentally important, but it was also enormous and challenging, and required a lot of physical techniques. It's all right at the crossroads of biology. In fact, the ribosome is older than DNA or proteins. It's the molecule that produces proteins. And, it goes back to a world where probably there was no DNA, and there's, RNA was the genetic material. It's called the RNA world hypothesis. And we can talk about that in a second. But I knew it was important. I also felt the technology had changed to make certain kinds of experiments possible with crystallography, which used synchrotrons and the fact that you can choose the wavelength of X-rays very precisely to get a signal from certain special atoms that you've put into the structure. So I knew that there was a breakthrough possible. I wasn't absolutely sure, and so I took a 40% pay cut to move from the US to England because I didn't know how long it would take. I didn't know how long it would take to get crystals that were good enough, or how long it would take to actually solve the structure, because, as I said, a group had been working on a different crystal form of a different part of the ribosome for almost 15 years, and there hadn't been any real breakthroughs in terms of actual structures. So I thought, maybe there are some real problems that I, may come across, and I don't know how long it would take. So. We had done a sabbatical in Cambridge about 7 years earlier, so she liked Cambridge. But we were very happy in Utah. I had great colleagues at the University of Utah. My wife and I like hiking and the outdoors and so on. And so it was a sacrifice. And I think what my wife said was, look, I've moved around with you all my life, and ever since we got married. And this is my last move. So if you want to do it, go ahead. I'll be okay with it. But I'm not moving again. And I have to say, I keep getting offers, to go back to the US and so on. And, those offers never last more than 10 seconds because, Pharaoh will just say, forget it, I'm not moving. I should say it happened in two stages. So the two halves, the ribosome has two halves. There's a smaller half and a larger half. The smaller half reads the code, the genetic code, and the larger half makes the protein chain. Now these two halves were solved in 2000, the atomic structures. And in some sense, that was the really big breakthrough because those two halves came out of nothing, So we did the small half, and Ada Yonat, who had, started this work many years earlier, had her own version of the small half of the subunit. And the group at Yale, which included my old professor, Peter Moore, was working with Tom Stites, who was the crystallographer in the effort, solved the large half. So it was a sort of quite a tense, competitive race, to try and get there with these first look at the ribosome in atomic terms. But then, if you want to understand how the ribosome works, you can't just have these two halves, separately. It'd be like, if you looked at what an engine looked like and what a crankshaft looked like, but never knew how they were put together and how they worked, right? So the focus then went on to solving the entire ribosome, caught in the act of actually, doing its job. And that took many more years. And our breakthrough there came in 2006, when we could get the structure of the whole thing with the piece of the genetic information and with the little adapter molecules that bring in the building blocks of proteins into the ribosome. And then, if you want to understand how a machine works, you have to look at it at different stages, like when the spark plug is firing and when the piston's going down and when the wheel is turning and so on. So we tried to arrest the ribosome at different stages. You have to think of it as a molecular machine that's moving along, making protein, according to instructions in our genes. And I have a very nice movie of it online that people can look up. If they just Google my name and ribosome movie, you can see it. And you can see this, but the way you do that is by trapping the ribosome at different points and then determining the crystal structure of those states. And then you sort of interpolate, but like between frames of a movie. So, when you go to one of these big X-ray beam lines, they come out of these huge accelerators, and that's what shoots out these X-rays, and you use the X-rays to hit your crystal and collect your data. So you apply for beam time on one of these instruments, and you often get a day or two, but that means you have to work non-stop around the clock. Okay, so we were given 2 days of beam time at a beam line outside of Chicago at Argonne National Lab. There were 4 of us, and we worked in 12-hour shifts so that there were always 2 people at any given time on the beam line, and we staggered it so there'd always be one person who was tiring and one person who was fresh. Okay, so we wouldn't, because we could not afford to make mistakes because we were in this tight competition. And so at the end of it, we had to do a quick calculation to see if the experiment had worked. And I remember, one of us had made a slight mistake in the calculation, and there was no signal there at all. And I thought, oh my God, we're just really out of it now. And but then I noticed that there was a slight mistake, and I redid the calculation, and this huge signal, these peaks popped out. And, we were all exhausted. First of all, we had come from England to Chicago, and, and then working round the clock with no rest. And we're just exhausted. And at the end of it, to know that it had worked, it was just all too much, and I'm not, I'm not such an exuberant guy normally, but I couldn't help it. I just sort of got up and started sort of dancing around the room saying, guys, we're going to be famous. And actually, every one of them did very well. They all, the graduate student who came with me from Utah, he's now a professor at Caltech. So he's, so all of them are doing very well. Yeah. Everybody knew that the ribosome is the target for lots of antibiotics, and it's because it's such an ancient molecule that our ribosomes are somewhat different from the ribosomes of bacteria. So some compounds will bind better to the bacterial ribosome and stop them from working, and they won't do much to our own ribosomes. That's how these antibiotics work, and there are many of them, tetracycline or erythromycin, azithromycin. All of us at some point need them. So we all knew that, and we knew that once we solved the structure, we'd be able to figure out exactly how these antibiotics bound to the ribosome. And if we knew that, we could design compounds that bound even better, at these sites, or even to new sites. And so that was not unexpected. I mean, in fact, when we published the first structure of this, what I call the small subunit, there were 2 back-to-back papers that we published. One was just the structure, another was the structure with 3 antibiotics bound to it to show how, they stop different aspects of ribosome function. So I think, and not surprisingly, pharmaceutical companies have taken this up. But there's a bigger problem with antibiotics, which has nothing to do with science, and that is, we have a huge problem now with emerging infectious disease and antibiotic resistant disease, but there's not a lot of money in it yet. And the reason is, if you have a patient who's got an antibiotic, an infection, you're going to treat him with generic, cheap antibiotics, unless the patient has drug-resistant, infection. And only then will you give this sort of new super antibiotic, right? So that means the patient pool is very small. And so there's not a lot of money to be made. And the other thing is, it's not like taking an anti-cholesterol drug or a blood pressure drug or diabetes drug that you have to pop a pill every day of your life, right? This is, you take a pill for, a week, and then you're cured, if the antibiotic's any good. So there isn't a huge profit. And so it has to do with how we fund new medicines. People don't remember that penicillin was not funded by private pharmaceutical companies. The British government launched a huge effort to develop penicillin because more soldiers were dying of infection in World War II than were actually being killed by bullets. And so there was a big push to develop penicillin. And so there's no reason why governments and, World Health Organizations, Gates Foundation, all these, nonprofits can't get into the act to develop new antibiotics for infectious disease. There are hundreds of thousands of prescriptions in the US for the common cold or flu, they give antibiotics. It's less true in Britain, where the NHS has very strict guidelines. And then another big problem is that people discovered completely by accident that if you give an antibiotic slurry into animal feed, the animals get fatter, okay? Probably what they're doing is they're changing the microbiome of the animal and they're gaining weight, okay? And so the agricultural industry uses antibiotics in cattle feed. And this is a terrible use of antibiotics because it's a guarantee that you can get resistance and spread of resistance. I think that we need to be very strict about antibiotic use and have proper guidelines. And we could even considering rotating antibiotics so that you take some off the market for a while and allow so the resistance goes away. So there's lots of things to think about. I think the most essential quality is you have to be curious and interested. You have to want to know the answer, and you have to be interested in the problem. If you're not interested in the question, you're not going to spend all those long hours of drudgery, trying to get at the answer. And, even whether you're doing theory or whether you're doing experiments, a lot of science is tedious. It involves just getting the job done, doing a lot of grunt work. There's lots of failure along the way. You try ideas, they don't work, and you have to say, okay, that didn't work, I'm going to try a different tack, and so on. And so it requires, first of all, a real curiosity and passion to know the answer. That's a given. Then it requires patience. You have to be able to tolerate failure and so on. It requires a little bit of, optimism, some mental strength. I joke that there are no pessimists in science. In my lab, there'll always be what we call Eeyores, from Winnie the Pooh. People are always complaining. But those people are not pessimists, because if they were real pessimists, they're just whiners. If they were real pessimists, they would have left the field, They would, because it takes a lot of optimism that, oh, well, things will eventually work out. I don't know how, but, it's going to work out. So that's the feeling that scientists need to have. And I think collegiality and, willingness to sort of ask for help, I think it's a very important aspect of science, because you shouldn't be embarrassed not to know something. Ignorance is not a sin, And so I would say my main strength is I've never been embarrassed to ask for help, from colleagues or even, my students and postdocs and so on. And I think that's allows you to sort of overcome stumbling blocks. People give you ideas or, that sort of thing. The ribosome, in a way, goes back to a world even before there was DNA or protein, because it is a ribosome that, evolved to make proteins. So it must have come from a world before there were any proteins. And so in a way it goes right back to the early beginnings of life, where information was probably carried by RNA, and a lot of the reactions were done by RNA as well, or maybe, with some random proteins that happen to be around. But it's called the RNA world hypothesis. So in that sense, the ribosome goes right back to some of the earliest times of life. So it's quite fundamental. And as I said, it's the thing that is a bridge between genetic information and the workhorses that actually carry out the functions of life, which are the proteins. I was lucky to hit on a problem that had such a long lifetime and still, is interesting. That doesn't happen very often in science. I was something of a rebel as a school kid, and there were about 3 or 4 grades when I just refused to study even for exams and was in the bottom third of my class. And my parents were really worried because I'd gone from being at the top of my class to the bottom third. And I thought their life was sort of interesting because they would always travel to interesting places, and all these people from America and England and other parts of Europe would come and visit. And so I thought, well, this is sort of an interesting life. But I didn't think that I would actually be a scientist. And to some extent, I thought if I went in that direction, I would rather be an engineer. I thought I would want to be an electronic engineer or something like that. And but that changed in the last couple of years of high school. But even then, I wanted to be an engineer. But then I didn't get into there are these IITs. A lot of Silicon Valley companies are founded by graduates of the Indian Institutes of Technology. They're these very elite schools which take like 0.5% or 0.1% of the applicants. And I didn't prepare for those exams, and so I didn't really do well, and I didn't make it. But then I got an Indian equivalent of what used to be the Westinghouse and what's now, well, I think it's called the Intel, but now it's something else. But anyway, it's a National Science Talent Scholarship. But if you took that scholarship, you could only do basic science. You couldn't do engineering. And so that's when I decided, actually, I think I'll be a scientist. And to some extent, my mother was behind my taking that exam. She said, you really should, try and do this. I was in South India in a town called Chidambaram, and my dad was in Madison, Wisconsin. I still joke that if he had, he was very worried about money, and he thought, oh, I can't afford to take my wife with me and so on, and especially if she's pregnant and, we have a kid, who's going to pay for it all, etc. So he was very worried about money. So he left my mom, with her family in South India and went off to do a postdoc. And I felt that if he had taken my mom with him, then I'd have been born in Wisconsin and I could have become president, but there we are. My dad was a biochemist, and my mom, as you know, went to McGill to get a Ph.D. in psychology. But when she came back, there wasn't really an opportunity for her. So they decided to team up, and they started looking at the effect of malnutrition on mental ability, mental retardation, and the relationship between malnutrition and mental retardation. So she could use her psychology background to analyze the mental retardation part. And they could also analyze in animal models what was happening in the brain when you starved animals and so on. So it kind of worked out for them, I think. They did work as a team. They published a lot of papers together. I wouldn't recommend it, actually. I think, it can work, but I think, I'm not so sure about it as a model. I think spouses should probably work in different labs or different, But it's happened so often. Pierre and Marie Curie, is a classic example, husband and wife team. And even their daughter, Irene Joliot-Curie, worked with her husband, and they won Nobel Prize as well. So it is a case that it does work in many cases. But I don't know. I like the idea that my wife is an artist and a children's book writer, and I come home and I don't have to talk science all the time. I thought physics was, I felt I didn't have the aptitude. Part of it was, this goes back to my telling you about, you have to care about the problem. Part of it is my thesis problem was something I was not that interested in, and it's slightly, I felt like maybe I didn't have an aptitude. I couldn't figure out where it was going. And so I also feel physics is a very mature field. And it's really hard to make big breakthroughs in physics. They don't come quite as, fundamental breakthroughs, and whereas in biology, we're still, making breakthroughs with very, very fundamental questions. I knew lots of physicists, Francis Crick or Max Delbruck, had gone into biology from physics and done very well. So I knew it was possible, and that's why I did it. But the important thing to remember is there are a lot of physicists who go into biology and they never stop being physicists. Everything looks like a physics problem to them. And they end up not doing very interesting work. They just talk to each other, and they don't influence the larger biological community. And I think what you should do if you make the transition is take that critical, analytical, quantitative way of thinking that you get as a physicist, but then become a biologist. Learn what it is to be a biologist and what the questions are. And then your physics background might help you in some indirect way, but you can't, just dabble in biology. I think that just doesn't work. I know Jim Watson personally. I met him many times and we've chatted because both of them did their big breakthrough in my institute, the Medical Research Council lab. It was actually the ancestor of my institute. And I never knew Crick personally, but I saw him at the next table in a faculty club when I was having lunch in UCSD. And I had done work that directly related to his ideas about the genetic code, and how the ribosome helps to read the genetic code. But I was too shy to go and introduce myself to him, and I sort of regret it. But on the other hand, I felt, you don't want to be a pest. These people are constantly having people come and interrupt them, and in some ways, I'm glad I didn't. I think their work was hugely important because when they began their work, nobody knew, people had just figured out that DNA somehow carries genetic information, okay? Nobody knew how a molecule could have genetic information. What the double helix structure of DNA, and of course, its discovery is very controversial because of data they used from Rosalind Franklin and so on. But, despite that, they were brilliant in putting together lots of information. Part of it came from Rosalind Franklin, part of it came from knowing what the right chemistry was of these bases, and then figuring out that these bases can only interact in certain ways, that an A interacts only with T, a C interacts only with G. The point of that was that when they got their structure, they could see in principle how each strand of DNA had the information to make the other strand, okay? And that means if you separated the two strands, then each one would make the other one, and then you'd have two copies. And that was the big mystery. How could you get two cells from one cell? Everything had to divide, right? And the information had to divide. And so it was a huge moment. It was like centuries, since we were humans, we've been wondering, how is it that we divide? How is it we give birth to offspring? How does, why do chickens only give rise to chickens, And how does a single cell, like an egg, grow into a whole organism? These were centuries-old mysteries. Suddenly, we started to understand in molecular terms how this all would work. So I would say, it was one of the great discoveries. At 500 years, most of, sorry to say, but most of the people in this academy will probably be sort of forgotten, okay? But, well, hopefully not, because, with digital media and so on. But something like the discovery of the structure of DNA, that's one of those things like Darwin's evolutionary theory or Mendel's discovering that there are genes, or the earlier idea that all life is organized as cells coming together. So these are very, very fundamental cornerstones that will just be there for forever. So when I started, I knew that the ribosome was this very large molecule, and it actually consisted itself of 50 proteins and 3 long pieces of RNA. No one knew anything about what it looked like, and no one knew anything about even where the proteins were. What were these 50 proteins and where were they even located? And so we were using an initial technique called neutron scattering in Peter Moore's lab. It was a collaboration with Don Engelman at Yale. And the idea was to try and find out where these proteins were on the ribosome by trying to measure distances between pairs of proteins, much like a surveyor does, triangulation and figures out a sort of topological map by measuring lots of distances. This was a similar sort of idea. Now, in the end, that didn't give you the kind of information you needed. And what happened also, since the time I joined the ribosome, soon afterwards, people very quickly realized that the real action in ribosomes was in the RNA part, not so much in the protein part. The proteins were doing something to help the RNA fold and work, etc. But the key functions were done by the RNA. And that seemed a much harder problem to tackle. And so many years later, I decided, almost 25 years later, I decided to, join a sort of effort. There was initially only one group working on it, Ada Yonat in Germany and Israel. But then, the project was sort of stalled for a while. And I felt that I had a different angle to how to get this, structure of the whole molecule, using a technique called X-ray crystallography, where you have to crystallize ribosomes. That is, you have to coax all these enormous ribosome molecules to come together into a very regular three-dimensional array, which is what a crystal is. It's essentially a three-dimensional array of molecules. If you're growing a salt crystal, every kid can do it. It's an elementary school project, or a sugar crystal. But if you're trying to crystallize something very large, it's quite complicated and uncertain. And then when you have the crystal, to use that crystal to get information about how to get a structure, an atomic structure of the ribosome, it was non-trivial at the time. Professors are funded on research grants, and the grants last typically 3 to 5 years. So if at the end of, let's say even if you have a 5-year grant, more typically you get a 4-year grant. If you have 4 or 5-year grant, that means by year 3 you have to have results, because you have to write your renewal application, so the grant continues, right? If you don't have results by 3 years, then you're in a very precarious position, because your grant won't be renewed, you'll run out of money, your university might tide you over for just a short bit, but then, they want you to do something else and so on. The lab I went to, which is the same lab where I'd done a sabbatical much earlier, is the MRC Laboratory of Molecular Biology, and it's very famous. It won its 16th Nobel Prize just a week ago. And the reason it's so successful is because it specializes in supporting long-term challenging problems. So you're never allowed to build a big empire there. They said, no, we want you to focus on what's really important. And for that, you don't need 30 people. You need, to figure out, this is what I want to do, and work with a small team and do it. And so you don't get a lot of money. And of course, as I told you, salary compared to the US is, not great. But you do have a lot of freedom and a lot of stability. And in my case, I had an additional advantage. It's it's the birthplace of crystallography. So there are people there who are real experts in crystallography. And this is a bit like if you're going on a long expedition, you know, in a vehicle, you'd want to take along people who really know about auto mechanics, you know, in case your car breaks down in the middle of the Sahara Desert or something like that, right? So if you're pushing the limits of what crystallography could do, you want people around who really understand the technique and can help you if there are technical problems. As it turned out, I didn't really end up needing them, but it was nice to know they were there, you know, if I did need them. The Nobel Committee often will have meetings, you know, where they invite people that they want to take a look at. But they sprinkle them among what I call a lot of decoys, you know, so they'll have the sort of conference on a general theme, and they're probably considering 3 or 4 people, a few people in that field, but they invite a lot of people in that field, right? So it becomes a kind of an audition, you know, and they had between 2000 and 2004, I think I went to Sweden almost every year I was invited. In 2004, there was this big, you know, dog and pony show, I call it, you know, with all these famous scientists, you know, and all kind of auditioning. And at that point, at the banquet, at that meeting, this well-known ribosome biochemist from Sweden came and started arguing with me. And he felt that I hadn't given him enough credit for work he had done in the 70s and 80s, late 70s and early 80s. And the reality was we didn't quite agree with, you know, the sort of ideas that they had in the 80s. They were, you know, they were good ideas and some parts were right, but the field had, I think, had moved on. Of course, he still doesn't agree. But so he got into this big argument, and then I found out a few months later that he was appointed to the Nobel Committee for Chemistry. So I figured, you know, there's no way I'm going to get the Nobel Prize. I mean, this guy doesn't agree with me at all about a really important aspect of what we had done, which is why the code is read so accurately by the ribosome. And it's a detail, you know, real technical detail, but it's an important detail. But so when I got so then I just didn't go to Sweden. I was invited to, you know, several meetings, and I think I went to one, just a small thing where a friend had invited me to give a talk at his institution, but I didn't go to any conferences in Sweden. I figured, why should I bother? And then in 2009, this phone call came along, and I was already in a bad mood because on my way to work, I had a flat tire and I had to walk the rest of the way to work, and I was late, you know. And so this phone rings and this woman says, you know, I'm calling from, you know, this Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences. This is a very important call. Could you please hold the line? And I thought, oh, this is just some prank, you know, because I have a couple of friends who love to play pranks. And we often used to joke, wouldn't it be great to, you know, have some Swedish postdoc, you know, call some famous scientist and say, hey, you've won the Nobel Prize, you know, just as a joke, because it would be kind of a cruel joke. It's just something to fantasize about. Anyway, so I thought it was absolutely sure, because I was so sure that I would be cut out of it. But what it shows is this guy had real integrity, you know, that he had his differences about one area. And, you know, in a committee, he doesn't even have to say, I'm bad. He could just say, oh, well, you know, Venki's okay, but I'm not sure. And that would be enough to kind of sink my chances, because at that level, unless everybody feels you're absolutely first rate, you know, you don't get past the filter, right? So I think it shows real integrity on his part. And maybe that's a reason. I mean, there are a lot of things to complain about with prizes in general. I'm not a fan of prizes, because science is not a sporting competition where you can measure who came first, second, and third. You know, it's a multidimensional thing. Different people contribute different things. And also, even those who make the breakthroughs depend on lots and lots of other things, you know, to make their breakthroughs. It's an entire sort of community that creates the breakthrough. And, you know, we're like, it's very much like a team sport. If you have to use a sports analogy, it's much more like soccer or football than it is like, you know, a track, okay? Where, you know, a team carries the ball and then the final person scores the goal. But, you know, who brought the ball all over, you know, the field to get it to that point? So I think it's a bit like that. And so I wasn't a huge fan, but maybe because they have integrity, the Nobel is respected. Take me, for example. I could never have done this work myself, okay? Even some of the ideas, you know, because when you're doing a big project, you know, people say, why don't we try this? Why don't we try that? You know, those ideas come from my students and postdocs and so on, you know? So, you know, I'm sort of of course, they wouldn't have done it without my saying, this is a project, we've got to do this, we've got to do this, and saying, yes, that's a good idea, let's go there. You know, so I am exercising leadership, but it would never have happened by myself. So it's really, so that's one aspect. But then there are lots and lots of scientists who've made important contributions, you know, like the person who figured out, you know, or the two people who figured out that you should use this compound to get a great signal. They tried it on a different system. And there were Jamie Kate and Jennifer Doudna. And Jennifer Doudna is here today as, you know, being honored. And she went on to discover, you know, one of the discoverers of CRISPR-Cas, which is for genome editing. But anyway, they came up with this compound that all of us used. So there's an example, you know, and Jamie Kate, you know, he's a brilliant guy, but, you know, he didn't get as much recognition as he might have. And so I think, you know, this is the kind of thing that prizes in some way misrepresent science. So I would say what we have to do is think of ourselves as kind of token representatives, you know, of science. You know, we're the lucky ones who got recognized for, you know, a large body of knowledge. We're lucky to happen to have made the breakthrough. I also don't think that it's very rare that, you know, so for example, if I hadn't made the breakthrough, it would have happened anyway, you know, not even that much later. And I think that's true of almost every aspect of science. And, you know, you think about calculus. You know, for hundreds of years, nobody had calculus. Suddenly, in the same lifetime, you know, Newton and Leibniz discovered calculus. You know, so why do you think that is? So I think it's because the state of knowledge had reached the stage where the next step was calculus. And, you know, so two people discovered it simultaneously. So I think that's what happens. You get to a point where the next step becomes obvious to a few people. But if those people hadn't existed, it might have happened a little later, you know, and somebody else would have realized it. Oh, it's always great to be recognized. And actually, you know, I mean, I don't want to be crass about it, but look, if you're an academic in Britain, you know, it's nice to have, you know, a big cash award. I was able to pay off my mortgage. I was able to help my son with his, and I bought him, he's a cellist, and I bought him a nice cello. So, you know, I put the money to good use. And, you know, so I think, and the fact that it gives you a kind of credibility, and it shows that your peers thought, you know, you're really a good scientist. I think that all feels good. I think there are two kinds of prizes in the Nobel. In the first case, you know, if you start a new field, it takes a very long time for people to figure out that actually this field is really important, okay? It has its early beginnings. People don't realize, you know, they think, oh, that's sort of interesting, you know, but they don't really realize how important it is. And that might take a very long time, okay? And then, you know, you get it 20, 30 years later. The most extreme is, you know, Peyton Rouse, who showed that viruses can cause cancer. And he had to wait, I think, 56 years for his Nobel Prize. Or the guy who discovered the electron microscope, Ernst Ruska, he discovered it he invented it just before World War II. And I think after the war, people simply forgot about him and kept on using electron microscopes and forgot that this guy had actually invented it. And he was in his 80s, 53 years later, he got the Nobel Prize. So that's one kind of prize. The other kind is where people know that the goal is very important and it's a question of having done it. And that was the case, say, with the structure of DNA or the structure of the ribosome. So many of these structure prizes only wait a few years before the Nobel is awarded. And in physics, often it'll go very quickly. So for example, the gravity waves, of course, it was predicted by Einstein a long time ago, in the 1918 or something, but 1915. But the fact is that it was only discovered, a couple of years ago, and because it was such a fundamental discovery, there was no real sort of doubt about it being prize-worthy. Humans are a mixture of being competitive and cooperative. We will cooperate in some circumstances and compete in others. And, if we don't recognize that, we're not acknowledging what it means to be human. And so science is the same way. Scientists will collaborate. Like the gravity wave thing was a huge, large-scale collaboration. Everybody, or the Higgs boson, thousands of scientists each had to do their little part, to make the whole thing happen. So that's a great example of cooperation. But often what will happen is there's a goal, and people know that if you get there first, you will get, the lion's share of the recognition. And that is a big driving force, because if the desire to be recognized and the desire to be acknowledged as, first rate and so on, it's human nature. And it does lead to kind of strange behavior too. I mean, competition, people in competition will, kind of elbow each other and metaphorically and try to, spin it so that, they've done the best or the most important part and so on. So it brings out what I think of as a somewhat dark side of human nature as well. When you're in a race, you try not to divulge where you are because you don't want other groups to speed up, and that is part of the unfortunate thing. So what I say is competition is great for science because it makes everybody really work hard and work smart, because they have to think hard about what they're doing because they can't afford to waste time on bad experiments, right? So they're really focused, working round the clock, very, intelligently. So it's great for science because it makes science go forward very quickly. And but it's not great for the scientists because it's so stressful. And it's stressful for the young people in the lab because, they're worried if they're scooped, what happens and so on. So, but often a lot of science is like that, and a lot of science isn't. And some science, you're doing something that's so far out and that no one else cares, but you are interested in it. And I think that's the best kind of science to do, where you're doing something no one else cares about, but you really feel is interesting. I think it was Thomas Edison who said, science is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. I think that's probably true, but you couldn't make the breakthrough without that 1%. And I think creativity, I see it as simply keeping an open mind and not closing yourself off to ideas and possibilities. If you see a weird result, just think about it. Don't just sort of dismiss it as, oh, that's a mistake, because it actually might be telling you something interesting. Or if somebody is working on some other problem or some unrelated thing, take an interest because, sometimes what he or she is doing might actually, be something that might give you that little magic bullet that you were looking for. So I think creativity simply means being really open to new ideas and new possibilities. And then somehow your brain puts it together, and it doesn't do it necessarily in a conscious way. And so I also think it's very important for people not to be, complete workaholics. I think that can kill creativity. And I think in America, I think people work far too hard. They just are under the, especially if they work for the private sector, they're under the gun all the time, and they're expected to be on, and with these smartphones, you're on call 24 hours a day, and if you don't answer your email in 5 minutes, people think something's wrong with you. I think that can kill creativity. What you need is long periods of time when you're doing nothing, just going for a walk or a hike or, bike ride or going to a concert. I think those are things that we need to have in our lives to foster creativity. And I think that's true for school kids. We shouldn't be, just dumping all this busy work on them so they don't have time to just play. I mean, play is creativity, that's where you learn to be creative, in play. There was a famous Indian mathematician named Ramanujan, about whom they made a movie with Jeremy Irons, called The Man Who Knew Infinity. Came out, and he used to dream up equations. He used to think of all these equations in his dreams, and he'd wake up and write them down. And so I think, creativity is a very funny business, imagination. India is going through, I think, a critical period. So after independence, there was a lot of optimism in India. And, but then, things sort of slowed down, and then the economy was opened up, and, it started, booming economically, but it also created great inequalities, as often happens when you have sort of free market economies booming. You also generate huge inequalities. And India is at a stage now where it isn't doing as well. It's not as far along as China in terms of technology, industrialization, manufacturing, science, basic science. Whereas 50 years ago, I would say Indian science and India in general was better off than China, okay? And I think in the meantime, what has also happened is that religious fundamentalist groups have gained much more of a voice and much more power in India. And I'm not against people being pious and religious. I have nothing against, people of whatever religion that they have. But if you have a country like India, which is very heterogeneous, it's got lots of different religions. There are more Muslims in India than any other country except Pakistan and Indonesia. So it's, one of the third largest, over 100 million Muslims. And so you cannot alienate, huge sections of your population, okay? You have to somehow all get along. And if you're a minority, you also have to make accommodations to living in the broader culture. You also can't segregate yourself and say, we're not going to deal with everybody. So I just think what India needs is for all these groups to just say, look, you're you, I'm me, that's fine. We'll get along, and let's, go and do what needs to be done. And what needs to be done is, first of all, you need education. Education is very patchy in India. If you're poor, your chances of getting educated are really bad. And if you're well off, you can go to a private school and get educated. And then, you need more universities, you need dedicated teachers, you need the kind of education that will prepare them for the manufacturing of tomorrow. So there are lots and lots of things to be done. And I think that's what India needs to focus on, and not worry about, these, what I call unproductive squabbles. I am an American citizen, and I've spent more of my life in the US than any other country, and I went there fairly young. So I do regard the US as, one of my countries. And I would say, you know, when I went to the US, what struck me, this was in 1971, what struck me was what a well-integrated, homogeneous country it was. There was a strong middle class. You know, rich and poor kids would go to the same local school, you know, things like that. And I felt that's what made America great, you know, that you know, you might live in a smaller house, in a slightly poorer part of town, but you'd still go to the same high school. And, you know, you'd have the same teachers, you'd hang out with everybody, you'd do okay. And then you'd, you know, if you were smart, you would rise up. And that kind of social mobility and social mixing is happening less in America now. People are segregating themselves into, you know, rich and poor neighborhoods, different schools, different life experiences. And it's going to get worse because, you know, people like Trump think it's because of trade, but trade is only a part of it. You know, a lot of it is because manufacturing and, you know, the economy is changing. Manufacturing no longer will employ those kinds of numbers of people that it did in the 20s and 30s and so on, or in the 19th century. And it's going to be highly automated. Machines are going to do more and more of what humans have been doing. Machines are now doing, they can read radiogram, you know, if you have an X-ray, they can read your X-ray as well as many radiologists, and, you know, better than most radiologists. So we have a situation where machines are going to do more and more of what humans traditionally have been doing. And this is leading to a hollowing out of the middle class. And so you have the 1% on one side who are benefiting from all this, you know, because it's making everything cheaper for them. And since they're very innovative and highly skilled, they're okay. And then you have the middle class. There are no middle class jobs, they're disappearing. And so they're going to do the low-end jobs, you know. And this is not a good recipe for society. And it means that the US, and we have the same problem in Britain, we need to think about how do we educate our population to prepare them for this new kind of world where they can still be productive. Okay, it's not an easy problem, it's an unsolved problem. But if we don't start thinking now, we could have a big social revolution on our hands. And I think the recent election in the US and even the Brexit referendum here are symptomatic of a much deeper problem. Human ribosomes are far more complex than bacterial ribosomes. And we also have mitochondria, which have their own kind of ribosome, which are totally different from bacteria or humans. And human ribosomes are also highly regulated. So for example, you know, what turns them on and off is very different than in bacteria. And there's lots of things like quality control and turning on ribosomes just when you need them, you know, like in nerve cells and so on. So there's lots and lots of work to do, and how viruses hijack ribosomes so that the ribosomes only translate viral genes to make viral proteins and shut down the host, you know, our own translation. So these are all interesting questions. So often what happens in science is you go to a problem and you solve it, and then there's not much else to do and you have to move on. But the ribosome turned out to be a rather rich gold mine. So, and perhaps I'm a little intellectually lazy and feel like, why should I bother thinking about something else? You know, maybe I should have, at some point I should have maybe thought I should do something different. But now, you know, I'm in my 60s and I have to, you know, I think it takes 5 years to learn a new field and another 5 years to be really good at it. And I sense that if I have 10 years, I could spend 10 years doing some interesting work on the ribosome where my lab is very well set up to do it. Or I could, you know, go off and maybe just start doing things and then I'd have to quit.